Last Sunday marks the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. Is the world more or less safe now than it was 25, 50, or 75 years ago at this armistice anniversary? The popular opinion is yes. However, I'm not so sure. There are many factors to look at in this question, and specifically, today I would like to focus on the general decline of personal family connections to World War I and World War II. The specific thesis is that intimate knowledge of the horrors of these wars has helped create the motivation and energy required to sustain this period of the long peace that we've had since 1945. And the concern is that with the rapid loss of first-hand historical knowledge, we are at risk of losing this driving force for peace and repeating history. So the first part of this is to look at the dinner table. For decades after World War I and World War II, there has almost always been someone at the Sunday dinner table with a direct connection to the war, either a parent, grandparent, child, aunt, uncle, or other family member who either fought in the war or they lived during it, either in Europe or abroad. And this connected citizens personally to history and served as a reminder of these horrors and hardships of wartime. And I believe it's this personal proximity to the 20th century that's been the important driving factor, as I mentioned, in sustaining this long peace. And of course, the concern is that as we lose connection to this part of the 20th century, that we lose what is driving the peace process. Now, just to show you how peace is not the normative structure, this is a graph here from Our World in Data where it shows the number of conflicts within European countries going back to the year 1500. As you can see, it's almost been consistent that there's been conflict, and then all of a sudden, this does drop off reasonably abruptly after the Second World War, other than, for instance, communist countries. The second graph I just wanted to show is this 2011 Pew Research poll, and it demonstrates how youth today are much less likely to have first-hand ties to the military. This, of course, was taken in the US, and as you can see, the question saying that they have an immediate family member who served in the military, those who are above the age of 65, 3/4 of them said yes, whereas those below the age of 30, between 18 and 30, said that only 1/3 of them have a family tie. And so we see this gradual decline with time, and we don't know how this will influence and impact society, because as we were showing in the previous graphs, really the normative structure has been that general civilians do have connections through family ties to people who have survived conflict, either having fought in it or as a result of being involved in the conflict themselves. As a personal note, I grew up with the attitudes towards Nazism, communism, war, peace, freedom, and tyranny heavily influenced by the stories of my grandmother, her and her family grew up during the Second World War in Yugoslavia, first oppressed by the Nazis, then by the communists, and in addition to the deadly crash of my grandfather's Canadian fighter jets. The second part I would like to look at is the wide-reaching impact of World War II. And it's really important to try to put into perspective these casualty numbers and the number of people which were affected by these events. This first graph here, it looks at the final death toll, both civilian and military combined, and the total number was 60 to 70 million souls. And this was 3% of the world's population there in 1940. When you break down the numbers by country, it's really important to keep this graph in perspective. You look here, for instance, at the United States, which is barely registering on this graph. In their case, they had around 420,000 deaths, which, as I say, is barely being registered on the graph, and they had an additional 670,000 wounded, which is not even registered or taken into consideration on this graph. As you go up looking into European countries, you can see that they had percentage of their population on average, here between 4% up to 6 and 8 and 10%. In Poland, they lost over 18% of the country's population in the Second War. And when you look into the absolute numbers, you have the staggering number here in the Soviet Union of just over 23 million people, or around 14% of their population, which was lost. China, similarly, 20 million and 4% of their population. Germany. These are really staggering numbers. It's really hard to put this into perspective. Here's another graph trying to show the fraction of the different countries' populations that died during the Second World War. Belarus at 25%, as we mentioned, Poland around 18%, but many other countries, Germany 11, 12%, the rest, Ukraine, again, probably around 17%. So this has had a dramatic impact on the social structure, the collective memory of many countries throughout Europe as well as the US. This is a chart which looks at global military deaths from World War II, which is the amount in red. And then we see all of the subsequent deaths throughout the ensuing decades in colonial conflicts, interstate conflicts, civilian conflicts. And as you can see, the numbers from these conflicts pale in consideration to that of the Second World War. I highly recommend this infographic. It comes from a website called The Fallen of World War II. It's an 18-minute documentary by Neil Holleran, and it uses these very effective graphs to try to put the casualty numbers in perspective. One other consideration is that in the years after World War II, not only did we have the collective memory of the war years, but we had the collective memory of the additional democide. Now, democide is a term that many people have not heard before. It's very popular from Professor Rummel, who on his website shows many of these numbers of where governments killed their own people, which is essentially democide. And so we have to remember that the 20th century saw an additional 260 million deaths as a result of government inflicting evil policies against their own civilians. And this number is 6 times more than all those who died during the century's wars. And so again, this is adding to the collective memory, both in the survivors of people who lived during this, as well as the collective memory of people who fought against these conflicts. Again, reinforcing the fact that peacetime is not the norm, and that what we have is very important to try and protect and maintain. One other way to try to look at the impact of the Second World War as a global phenomenon is to look at the number of people within a country that were involved in military endeavors. As we were seeing on that graph, for instance, with total deaths, we saw that in the US, the numbers were not as high relative to other countries in Europe. I couldn't find, unfortunately, readily a graph going country by country showing the percentage of the population involved, but I did find from the Prospect Journal this graph here, which shows the number deployed in the United States in the Second World War as a percentage of 100,000 people in the population. As you can see, roughly 12% of the total U.S. population was involved in the conflict of the Second World War, and this is more than all their other past conflicts, and significantly more than conflicts post. And to put this number into perspective in absolute numbers, there was a staggering 16 million people involved in the U.S. which were in service or deployed, and this is many-fold higher than even the Second World War and other conflicts since. Even something such as Vietnam, which has had perhaps a more recent lasting memory in the shape of U.S. consciousness, had at that time 3.4 million in service or deployed. Or Iraq, Afghanistan, we're looking at 2.5 million. And so this gets back to that part where we discussed at the beginning of the conversation that after the Second World War and the First World War, I feel that many people had at the dinner table someone who was involved within the conflict in a personal manner. And this definitely has probably shaped a significant part of the ensuing history. Which leads us to part 3, about the forgotten past. As we lose direct ties to past family member connections, the role of education in remembrance becomes even greater in order to maintain our commitment for it to never happen again. Regretfully, despite wonderful advancements in education, allegedly, more people than ever, it seems, leave school completely ignorant of history and the evils of the 20th century. I want to show a few examples. The first here is from the UK History Channel, where they did a survey. They found, although over half of the nation claimed to be knowledgeable about the World War II, almost 1/3 had no idea what the Blitz was as a World War II event. And of course, this is happening in the UK, this survey. Furthermore, an alarming 1 in 10 had no idea Adolf Hitler was involved in World War II, with some even believing Germany and Britain were on the same side, at 8% of the population believing that. Despite being widely recognized as a battle that ended the Second World War, the poll revealed that 60% of the UK population can't name 1944 as the year that D-Day landings took place. Over a third of the UK adults polled didn't know the Battle of Britain took place during World War II, and 33% didn't know the attack on Pearl Harbor took place in Hawaii. We go to a second poll in 2009 from the Telegraph, again in the UK. This was a poll specifically of people between the age of 15 and 19. Almost half did not know in which year the war began. When asked who used the famous words, "We shall fight them on the beaches," over a third did not recognize the speaker as Winston Churchill, and 7% attributed this to Adolf Hitler, while other responses included Stalin and Henry VIII. And don't forget, Britain was deeply involved in World War II, and so these poll results are just appalling. And we have to remember that for these children, the war is remote as the Middle Ages. For many of them, their grandparents did not even live through it. And that was the ending line from that Telegraph article in 2009. So in addition to problems with collective memory about the war in general, I would like to also highlight collective ignorance about the Holocaust, right? Because in the case of the Holocaust, countless dollars have been spent in education campaigns, museums, memorials, and significant efforts around the world to educate people about the Holocaust. Yet awareness about this remains low. Now, NPR had a very worthwhile 3-minute summary of the importance of the Holocaust that I would highly recommend listening to. But let's go into some of the survey data, which shows really horrible knowledge on this, and it's even more striking given the significant efforts to build museums, memorial services, online and TV and programming on these issues. So in February 2018, just a few months ago, a survey of 1,350 adults over the age of 18 was conducted in the United States. And I can't find how this conducting company defined the word millennial, but generally a millennial is someone between the age of 18 and 36. They found 11% of adults and 22% of millennials were unaware or not sure of hearing about the Holocaust. So almost 1 in 5 people below the age of 36 have not heard about the Holocaust or weren't sure. 31% of all U.S. adults and 41% of millennials believe that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed. And of course, the number is much closer to 6 million. 45% of all U.S. adults and 49% of millennials could not name a single concentration camp and ghetto. And just to emphasize this point, 41% of U.S. adults and 66% of millennials were unable to identify what Auschwitz was. And, 80% of Americans have not visited a Holocaust museum and 66% do not know a Holocaust survivor. Now, these numbers are not unique to the United States. What we have below here is a chart from the Roper Center, and they conducted a poll in the UK, found very similar levels of ignorance, but even higher levels. For instance, this survey conducted by the Roper Center was done in multiple countries, and we can say that in the UK, for the question, from what you know or have heard, what were Auschwitz, Dachau, or Treblinka? In this case, 47% of people either had the incorrect answer or didn't know in the UK. Again, this is staggering given that the Britain was such a integral part and decimated by World War II, that this knowledge is just forgotten. And even in many other countries which had concentration camps within them, Germany, Austria, Poland, you still find parts of the population, almost 1 in 5 people, completely unaware of what these places were. So as we look towards threats for peace, we're essentially left with the fact that a nation's strength is in many ways proportionate to its collective stories, and the generations who lived through the world wars are mostly passed on, which unfortunately leaves the school system to educate many students in history, but it seems they've been quite incapable of doing so in either both a quantitative or a qualitative understanding of the facts. And with the continued loss of this direct connection to World War I and World War II, and with decreased enrollments in the military, few civilians have a first-hand connection to the horrors of this 20th century. And as mentioned, I do think that it's this direct personal connection to these horrors that has helped drive the survivors to work towards peace and prosperity in these post-World War decades. And as we lose this memory, we place ourselves complacent to repeat the atrocities of the past, to forget how bad things can be, and to fail to take the necessary steps to avoid conflict, preserve peace, and fight against evil and injustice. To end, 3 quotations. One was from NPR, where the commentator mentioned it's hard to tell people to never forget when they haven't heard. The second is from Sanatana, who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And the third is from Cicero, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by records of history?" And so on this Remembrance weekend, lest we forget.